Bankruptcy is not at all what people tell you. Let me explain what I mean. Welcome to the Ascend Finance YouTube channel, where we help folks understand what happens when you file bankruptcy. Now keep in mind, all of our videos are made for informational purposes only, including this one, so it should not be construed as any kind of legal advice. Also, if this video is confusing at all, please don't hesitate to call or text us at 833-272-3631. I understand that sometimes leaving comments can be hard, so you're more than welcome just to call or text us at that number, and I'll have someone from my team reply to you as soon as possible. Okay, so what really happens when you file bankruptcy? Is it just like how people make it seem? Is it like a painful process that's ruining your life forever? Let's find out. I'm gonna cover three things in today's video. First, I'll cover how Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 bankruptcy works. Second, I'll talk about what happens once you file. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with, is bankruptcy worth it? Now let's dive into how Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 work. I'm gonna start with Chapter 7. You know, I like to call this one the bankruptcy that actually feels like bankruptcy.
What?
Just kidding, but not really. So Chapter 7 has a quick 3 to 4 month process typically, where most, if not all of it, your unsecured debt is being discharged, basically wiped away. Now, not everyone can actually file this type of bankruptcy though. You typically need to qualify. And now in order to qualify for this, you basically need to make less than the income threshold for your household size and state. So let's, for an example, use California. And let's say you're in a household of 2, okay? So let's say it's you and your spouse, for instance. And if that's the case, then you potentially need to make less than $96,600 a year before taxes as a household. That's the current income threshold at the time of this video, which can often change. I'll mention actually a resource that you may be able to use that'll actually have the most up-to-date means test data. So I know some of you are probably ready to throw your laptop at me and say, well, why does the court look at gross income? I don't receive all that. I get it, I promise. However, there is a second part of the means test that actually accounts for that. The second part basically assesses your disposable income. So if you're above the income threshold, or if you're super close, but you don't have any disposable income after paying all your normal expenses, not including the debt, then you may qualify. However, you'd most likely need to confirm with a local attorney. Now, you're always also welcome to just take our free Chapter 7 calculator. This is actually linked in the description. It'll help you estimate the cost and qualification for a Chapter 7 based on your zip code. It's completely free, and you don't even need to add an email address. Okay, so the one thing about Chapter 7 is that you could potentially be at risk of losing some of your more important assets. Now, those assets typically are cars and homes. In order to determine whether you actually lose any of those, you'd want to first understand your state's exemptions and how much they allow you to have in equity and still keep the assets. So let me give you another example. Let's again use California. So let's say California's homestead exemption is $300,000. Now keep in mind that it may be more than this. I'm just using $300,000 for the example. Now let's say someone owns a home and has $200,000 in home equity. Well, in that case, if they decided to go through with a Chapter 7, then their home should potentially be protected since they have less home equity than the exemption. Now on the other hand, let's say if they had $450,000 worth of home equity, then they may not be able to keep the home if they did a 7 because that exceeds the $300,000 homestead exemption in this example. Furthermore, having more home equity than the exemption can also potentially impact a Chapter 13 plan. It actually more so impacts what your plan payment would be. And we actually go into details on that in a different video, which I'll link in the description as well. Okay, let's now go through the cost for a Chapter 7 and a Chapter 13. Chapter 7 typically ranges from $1,000 to $3,000. It really depends on where you are in the country, as there are some areas where an attorney may be more expensive than others. Now for Chapter 13s, the fees are typically around $3,000 to $7,000. And most of the times those fees are going to be paid throughout the Chapter 13 plan, although some of those fees may be paid upfront before filing. Okay, so now let me briefly go through Chapter 13. So as you kind of heard, I mentioned that you pay the attorney fees through the plan. So typically a Chapter 13 is going to be around 3 or 5 years. And when that happens, you're really basically making a payment to the trustee each month, and they're going to be dispersing payments through to each different party. So it could be the bankruptcy attorney, it could be your unsecured creditors, all the above. And I'll actually mention later in this video that, as I'll kind of dive in next, of like what happens when you file the bankruptcy. But the whole idea of a 13 is for folks that may not qualify for a Chapter 7, or they may have assets that they could potentially lose if they went through a Chapter 7. And so the Chapter 13's there. So you're basically on an income-based plan for the next 3 or 5 years. Okay, so what happens when you file bankruptcy? We actually go into detail on this in our 9-part series, which you kind of may want to watch so you can get really detailed into it. But for now, I'll cover it from a high level. So when you file bankruptcy, there's typically a few meetings that you'll have to appear, whether that may be a telephonic or virtual versus being in person. That being said, it's probably important to communicate with your attorney on that, as they'll provide more information on whether it's in person for you or not. Okay, now once your Chapter 7 bankruptcy has been confirmed, you'll most likely receive your discharge when it's been 3 to 4 months since you initially filed. That's when we've seen the average rate of being discharged. Now for Chapter 13s, the attorney would most likely propose a plan, payment to the court, and if they approve it, you'll now be on that 3 or 5 year plan that I was mentioning. You'll make a payment to the trustee each month, and like I said, they'll distribute to each party. Like the trustee will make payments to your creditors, to your attorney. I kind of went over this already, but that's what will kind of happen once you file. And then again, for Chapter 13, you'll receive your discharge once you've either reached the 3 or 5 year mark, or you've potentially paid back all of the unsecured debt. So either one of those things, once that kind of hits, you'll most likely be discharged. Let's wrap up with, is bankruptcy worth it? Now, honestly, to help determine whether bankruptcy worth it, it may be helpful to understand whether you can qualify. So you can take the Chapter 7 bankruptcy calculator, again linked below. That way you can first estimate whether you qualify for Chapter 7. And if you don't appear to qualify for a 7, then it may make sense to look at whether your Chapter 13 plan payment would be affordable, and even other options like outside of bankruptcy. There are times where you may end up having to pay 100% of the debt back in a Chapter 13. So if that's the case, it may be helpful to compare to other options. So feel free to take the calculator. That way you're able to make the most informed decision and make sure it's the cheapest, easiest, and fastest. All right. Well, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to give us a call or text at 833-272-3631. Have a great rest of your day.